The night was bitter cold as I stood on our front porch, my thin jacket doing little to shield me from the harsh December wind. My father's words still rang in my ears, each syllable sharp as ice. "Get out," he had said, his voice trembling with rage. "You're no daughter of mine." My name is Amanda Chin, and at 17, I became everything my traditional Chinese-American parents feared. Pregnant, unmarried, and, according to them, a disgrace to the family name. I watched through blurry eyes as my mother lingered by the window, her face a mask of disappointment before she turned away, letting the curtain fall. The message was clear. I was alone now. The few possessions I managed to grab were stuffed into my school backpack, some clothes, my phone charger, and the positive pregnancy test that had shattered my family just hours ago. My hand instinctively went to my still flat stomach, protecting the life growing inside, even as my own world crumbled around me. Jason, my boyfriend and the baby's father, had disappeared the moment I told him. No calls, no texts, nothing, just radio silence and blocked social media accounts. The coward. I made my way down the familiar street where I had grown up, past the maple tree I used to climb, and the garden my mother tended so carefully. Each step felt like leaving another piece of myself behind. The streetlights cast long shadows as tears froze on my cheeks. Mrs. Rodriguez, our elderly neighbor, was the one who found me hours later, huddled on a park bench trying to stay warm. She had always been kind to me, sneaking me extra cookies when I was younger and teaching me Spanish phrases while she gardened. "Oh my," she whispered when I told her everything through chattering teeth. "Come inside before you freeze." Her small apartment was warm and smelled like cinnamon tea. She didn't judge. Her lecture just listened as I poured out my fears between sobs. How could I raise a baby? Where would I live? What about school? The questions seemed endless. "One day at a time," she said firmly, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders. "First, you need a safe place to sleep. You'll stay here tonight, and tomorrow we'll figure out the next step." That night, curled up on Mrs. Rodriguez's lumpy couch, I dreamed of my mother. In the dream, she was in her garden, carefully pruning her beloved roses. But as I watched, the flowers withered and died under her touch, crumbling to dust. I woke up crying. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me enroll in a program for pregnant teens where I could continue my education while getting support and prenatal care. I found a job at a local diner, working the morning shift before classes. The hours were long, and my feet ached constantly. But every dollar I earned went into a savings account for my baby. My parents never called. I would see my mother sometimes at the grocery store, but she would turn down another aisle, pretending not to notice me. My father's car would speed up if he passed me walking to work. It was like I had become a ghost in my own hometown, invisible to the people who had raised me. The other girls in my program became my lifeline. We shared our stories, our fears, and our dreams over lukewarm cafeteria food. Many of them had similar tales: families who couldn't accept their choices, boyfriends who vanished, futures that seemed to shrink with each passing day. But something unexpected happened. As my belly grew, I found strength I didn't know I had. Each kick from my baby reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I studied harder than ever, determined to graduate despite my circumstances. The diner manager noticed my work ethic and gave me more responsibilities along with a small raise. When I felt my baby move for the first time, I was alone in my tiny rented room, studying for a chemistry test. The flutter was so faint I almost missed it, like butterfly wings against my skin. I pressed my hand to the spot, tears flowing freely as I whispered, "Hello, little one. I'm your mom." It was a girl. The ultrasound technician pointed out her tiny features on the grainy screen, her spine, her heart, her perfect little profile. I asked for extra printouts, secretly hoping to share them with my parents. They sat in my bag for weeks before I finally threw them away, accepting that some bridges couldn't be rebuilt. Mrs. Rodriguez helped me prepare for the baby's arrival, teaching me to knit tiny hats and booties. Her arthritis made her movement slow, but her stories kept me company as we worked. She told me about raising her own children as an immigrant, about the challenges she faced and overcame. Life never gives you more than you can handle, she would say, her needles clicking steadily, even when it feels impossible. The contractions started during my final exam of senior year. I gritted my teeth through the pain, determined to finish the test before heading to the hospital. My water broke in the taxi, and 12 hours later, I held my daughter for the first time. Lily Marie Chen came into the world at 6:43 a.m. on a Tuesday, weighing 7 pounds, 2 ounces. She had a full head of dark hair and my mother's eyes. As I counted her tiny fingers and toes, memorizing every detail of her perfect face, I made her a promise. "You will never doubt that you're loved," I whispered. "Never." Mrs. Rodriguez was my only visitor in the hospital. She brought homemade tamales and sang over Lily in rapid Spanish. The nurses gave me sympathetic looks when no other family showed up, but I barely noticed. My whole world had narrowed to the small bundle in my arms. Graduation day fell 2 weeks after Lily's birth. I walked across the stage to receive my diploma, with her strapped to my chest in a baby carrier. Her weight was a reminder of everything I fought for. There was no one in the audience cheering for me, but the other girls from my program whooped and hollered enough to make up for it. That summer passed in a haze of sleepless nights and endless diaper changes. I moved into a tiny studio apartment, barely big enough for a bed and Lily's crib, but it was ours. Paid for with my own money. The walls were thin and the neighborhood wasn't great, but it was home. Every morning, I would wake before dawn to feed Lily before dropping her at daycare next to the diner. The owner, Maria, had a soft spot for young mothers and gave me a discount on childcare. I worked double shifts whenever I could, saving every extra penny for our future. Sometimes on my walks home, I would pass my parents' house. The lights would be on, shadows moving behind the curtains, life continuing as if I had never existed. Once I saw my mother in the garden, and for a moment, our eyes met. She looked older, tired, but before I could raise my hand to wave, she turned away, just like that night on the porch. I cried myself to sleep that night, Lily's soft breathing the only sound in our tiny apartment. But in the morning, I got up, put on my uniform, and kept going because that's what mothers do. The years would pass, each one bringing new challenges and triumphs. But that first year, the year I lost my family but found myself, that was the hardest. And as I rocked my daughter to sleep each night, I wondered if my mother ever thought of us. If she missed the granddaughter she'd never met. I had no way of knowing then that 15 years would pass before I heard from my mother's voice again. That when the phone finally rang, everything would change. 15 years can change a lot. I had worked my way up from waitress to restaurant manager, eventually saving enough to open my own small cafe. Lily had grown from that tiny baby into a bright, confident teenager who filled our home with laughter and music. The night the call came, I was going over the cafe's monthly expenses while Lily practiced violin in her room. The unknown number flashing on my phone made me hesitate before answering. Amanda. The voice was older, more fragile than I remembered, but unmistakably my mother's. My hand tightened around the phone as memories flooded back. That cold December night, the turnbacks, the years of silence. "Your father is dying," she said, her voice cracking. "Cancer. The doctors say he has weeks, maybe days. He's asking for you and Lily." I sat there stunned as she continued. "I know we don't deserve to ask anything of you. But please, he wants to meet his granddaughter before." She trailed off, leaving the sentence unfinished. The violin music from Lily's room stopped, and I heard her footsteps in the hallway. "Mom, who's on the phone?" I covered the receiver with my hand. "Just a work call, sweetie. Keep practicing." My mother must have heard her voice because she made a small choke sound. "She sounds lovely," she said. "She is," I said firmly. "No thanks to you or Dad." The silence that followed was heavy with 15 years of unspoken words. Finally, my mother spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I was wrong, Amanda. So terribly wrong." I closed my eyes, fighting back tears. How many nights had I dreamed of hearing those words? How many times had I imagined this moment of acknowledgement? But now that it was here, I felt nothing but a deep, aching exhaustion. "I need time to think," I said. "And I need to talk to Lily. This isn't just about me anymore." "Of course," my mother replied quickly. "Just please don't wait too long." After hanging up, I sat at the kitchen table, my mind racing. The cafe's paperwork lay forgotten as memories crashed over me like waves. The day I told them I was pregnant, the look of disgust on my father's face, my mother's silence, perhaps more painful than his rage. Lily appeared in the doorway, violin still in hand. At 15, she looked so much like I had at her age. The same dark eyes, the same stubborn chin. But where I had been uncertain, she carried herself with quiet confidence. "That wasn't a work call, was it?" she asked, setting her violin down. "You're crying." I touched my cheek, surprised to find it wet. "No, it wasn't." "Come sit down, sweetheart. There's something we need to talk about." She listened quietly as I told her about my parents, about that night 15 years ago, about all the things I'd never had the courage to share before. Her face remained thoughtful, processing each detail with a maturity that made my heart ache. "So my grandfather is dying," she said when I finished, "and he wants to meet me." I nodded, watching her carefully. "Yes, but it's completely your choice. We don't owe them anything." Lily was quiet for a long moment, absently plucking at a loose thread on her sleeve. "I want to go," she said finally. "Not for them, but for you. You deserve closure, Mom." I pulled her into a tight hug, marveling at how wise my daughter had become. "When did you get so smart?" She grinned against my shoulder. "Must be all those books you make me read." The next morning, I called my mother back. Her answer was immediate, as if she'd been sitting by the phone waiting. "We'll come," I said, keeping my voice steady. "Tomorrow afternoon. But I have conditions." "Anything," she breathed. "First, this is about Lily. If Dad says one word, one single word, to make her feel unwelcome or unwanted, we leave. Second, I won't pretend the past didn't happen. No sweeping it under the rug for a family reunion. And third," I took a deep breath, "you need to hear our story. All of it. Everything you missed while you were pretending we didn't exist." There was a pause, then a soft, "Yes, of course." I spent that night going through old photos, Lily's first steps, her first day of school, dance recitals, violin concerts. 15 years of memories they had chosen to miss. Each picture was a reminder of how much we'd accomplished on our own, but also of how much they had lost. Mrs. Rodriguez had passed away 5 years ago, but I still had the first baby hat she'd knitted for Lily. I packed it with the photos. A tangible piece of the woman who had been more family to us than our own blood. The drive to my parents' house the next day felt surreal. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. Same neat lawns, same trimmed hedges. My mother's roses still bloomed in the front garden, though they looked a bit wild now, less carefully tended. Lily squeezed my hand as we walked up the familiar path to the front door. "Ready?" she asked. I looked at my beautiful, strong daughter and felt a surge of pride. "Ready." The door opened before we could knock. My mother stood there, smaller than I remembered, her hair now more gray than black. Her hands trembled as she reached toward me, but dropped to her sides. "Amanda," she whispered. "You came." Her eyes moved to Lily, widening slightly. I saw the recognition there, the sharp intake of breath as she noticed all the ways my daughter resembled her younger self. "Would you like to come in?" she asked, stepping aside. I nodded, guiding Lily forward with a hand on her back. As we crossed the threshold, I couldn't help but remember the last time I'd walked through this door, young, scared, and alone. But this time was different. This time, I wasn't that helpless teenager anymore. And this time, I wasn't alone. The inside of my childhood home felt smaller than I remembered. Family photos still lined the hallway walls, but they stopped abruptly at my senior year, the last one taken before everything fell apart. It was like time had frozen in this house, preserving the moment just before their perfect family shattered. My father was in the living room, propped up in a hospital bed that seemed out of place among the familiar furniture. The strong, imposing man who had thrown me out 15 years ago was gone, replaced by someone frail and diminished. His eyes, though, were the same, dark and intense, as they fixed on Lily. "Soki said," his voice rough, "This is my granddaughter." Lily stepped forward, her chin lifted slightly. "I'm Lily," she said clearly. "It's nice to meet you, though I wish it hadn't taken so long." I saw my father flinch at her words, but a ghost of a smile crossed his face. "Direct, like your mother," he said. "Please, sit down. Both of you." My mother hurried to arrange the chairs. Her movements were nervous and jerky. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, my father spoke again. "I owe you both an apology," he said, "though I know it's far too late. 15 years too late." I agreed, my voice steady. "Do you know what it was like being 17, pregnant, and homeless in winter? Having to rely on the kindness of neighbors because my own parents threw me away." My mother made a small, pained sound. "Amanda, we were trying to." "To what?" I cut her off. "To protect the family name. To teach me a lesson." "Well, congratulations." The lesson I learned was that I could never count on either of you. I pulled out the stack of photos I had brought, spreading them across the bed. "This is what you missed." Lily's first steps, her first day of kindergarten, every Christmas, every birthday, every milestone you chose not to be part of. They leaned forward, hungry for these glimpses of the life they'd ignored. My mother's hand trembled as she touched a photo of Lily in her first ballet costume. "You look just like your mother did at that age," she whispered to Lily. "I wouldn't now," Lily replied quietly. "I don't have any pictures of Mom from back then." The silence that followed was deafening. My father picked up a photo of Lily's elementary school graduation, where she'd won the Academic Achievement Award. "You did well with her," he said finally. "Better than we did with you." "I did everything you said I couldn't," I said, finishing my thought. "I finished high school, built a career, raised an amazing daughter, all without your help or approval. And I own my own business now," I continued. "The cafe, Ham Maple Street. That's mine. I worked my way up from waitress to owner. Funny how the daughter you were so ashamed of turned out to be successful after all." My father's face crumpled, and for the first time in my life, I saw tears in his eyes. "I was wrong," he said, his voice breaking. "So terribly wrong. My pride, my stupid, stubborn pride, cost me my daughter and my granddaughter." "Yes, it did," I agreed. But that's not why we're here today. We're here because Lily deserves to know where she comes from, even if that history isn't pretty. And because I hesitated, then continued, because despite everything, you're still my parents. My mother reached for my hand, and this time I let her take it. Her fingers were cold and shaking. "Can you ever forgive us?" she asked. I looked at Lily, who had been watching this exchange with quiet intensity. "That depends," I said. "Are you ready to be real grandparents? To show up for real? To remember birthdays? To be there when we need you? Because if this is just about easing your conscience before Dad dies, then no, I won't put Lily through that." "I don't have much time left," my father said softly. "What your mother does, I've made her promise to do better. To be there in all the ways we should have been before." Lily stood up suddenly. "I have a violin competition next week," she announced. "First chair in the youth symphony. Will you come, grandmother?" My mother's face lit up, even as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, of course." Over the next few weeks, as my father's condition deteriorated, we began the slow, careful work of rebuilding bridges. It wasn't easy. There were moments of tension, of old hurts resurfacing, of harsh words that needed to be said. But there were also moments of healing. My mother came to the cafe, proudly telling customers that her daughter was the owner. She attended Lily's violin competition, beaming from the audience. She even helped us plant a small herb garden behind the cafe, teaching Lily the gardening skills I'd never let her teach me. My father held on long enough to see Lily perform a private violin concert in his room, her music filling the house with something that felt like forgiveness. He died peacefully the next day, holding both our hands. At the funeral, I stood between my mother and daughter, thinking about the long, twisted path that had led us here. The years of pain and silence, the strength I'd found in solitude, the daughter who had taught me more about love and resilience than my parents ever had. "What happens now?" Lily asked later as we sat in her apartment above the cafe. I looked at my mother, who had come home with us, who was learning to be the grandmother she should have been all along. "Now," I said, "we write a new story together." That night, as I lay in bed, I thought about this 17-year-old girl standing alone in the cold, thinking her life was over. I wish I could tell her that she was stronger than she knew, that she would build a beautiful life from the ashes of what was lost. But mostly I wish I could tell her that sometimes the hardest paths lead to the most meaningful destinations. That forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, but it can mean finding peace. And that love, even when it seems completely broken, has a way of coming full circle. My thumb buzzed with a text from my mother, "Lunch tomorrow." "I'd love to hear more about your high school years with Lily." I smiled as I typed back, "Yes, there's so much to tell." Because that's the thing about family. Sometimes you have to lose it to find it again. Sometimes you have to break apart completely before you can rebuild something stronger. And sometimes, just sometimes, 15 years isn't too long to wait for a second chance.